I am honored to present our final keynote speaker, a friend, a colleague, and a distinguished scholar, Professor SharonFainman. Professor Feynman-Nemser serves as the Mandel Professor of Jewish Education at Brandeis University and is a founding director of the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education. She earned her BA from the University of Michigan, her MA in instruction from Teacher College, Columbia University, New York. She has written extensively about the curriculum and pedagogy of teacher education, the induction of new teachers, mentoring, and teachers' professional learning. She co-edited the third handbook of research on teacher education, Enduring Issues in Changing Contexts, 2008, and recently published Teachers as Learners, 2012, with Harvard Education Press. Professor Feynman-Nemser will turn teacher education upside down. Professor Feynman-Nemser, the floor is yours.
And to advance, I just hit this. Can they go forward? Okay.
You have a clicker over here.
Okay.
Forward, backward.
I can do it. Okay. Before I start, I want to offer my personal and public thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference, all the people from the ministry, from MOFET, from the university and colleges, all of the people who worried about our intellectual and physical needs over these last 3 days. This has been really a wonderful celebration, a stimulating exchange. I always feel so inspired and moved by working with my colleagues, my fellow teacher educators in Israel. I love to come here and work with you, and I'm really thrilled to be here. But thank you so much for creating this wonderful forum. Michael Connolly started this morning by talking about Schwab and the practical, and I think it's appropriate I'm also going to talk about practice, this time the practice of teaching and teacher education. The title for my talk, Lahafoch Hachsharat Morim al Harosh. This is the end of my dual translation. I didn't want to put anybody out of business. Comes from a 2010 report of a Blue Ribbon panel on clinical preparation and partnerships. Oops. I think I won't use this. I'll just do it that way. The report declares that the education of teachers needs to be turned upside down, away from academic preparation and education courses loosely tied to school-based experiences, to programs fully grounded in clinical practice. The teaching is a profession of practice, the report declares. Prospective teachers must be prepared to use professional knowledge to advance student learning and to build their professional knowledge through practice. In order to achieve this, we must place practice at the center of teacher preparation. Placing practice at the center of teacher education is not a new idea, and I'll shortly consider whether there's anything actually new about this recommendation by comparing some historical and contemporary efforts by teacher educators to teach the practice of teaching. But I want to linger for a moment on the underlying assumption that teaching practice can be taught. It's not such a self-evident idea. Many people actually believe that good teachers are born, not made, that the capacity to teach is a natural endowment which some people are blessed with and others are not. Because of the prevalence of this view, I was very surprised by a cover story that appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine the same year that the Blue Ribbon report that I referred to was published. The article carried the title, Building a Better Teacher, which implicitly challenges the view that getting good teachers is primarily a function of recruiting people with the right stuff. The article featured the work of 2 educators who are currently engaged in the effort to teach people how to teach. This is my fancy slides. The picture on the left shows Deborah Ball and comes from a report of a new organization called Teaching Works, which she and her colleagues at the University of Michigan have recently started. And the picture on the right shows the cover of a book by Doug Lemoff called Teach Like a Champion. Deborah Ball is widely known for her groundbreaking work on teaching mathematics in elementary school and the intricate skills and complex subject matter knowledge that it requires. Now, as Dean of the School of Education at the University of Michigan, Ball and her colleagues have identified a set of core teaching practices linked to subject matter knowledge that teacher candidates need to master to be responsible practitioners. And they have placed the learning of these core practices at the center of their teacher education program. Doug Lemoff, the second educator featured in the New York Times article, is the founder of a network of charter schools and the author of the book, Teach Like a Champion, 49 Techniques that Put Students on the Path to College. Lemoff discovered these techniques by traveling around the country, videotaping hundreds of teachers, and studying their practice. Lemoff believes that a teacher can't succeed unless he can hold students' attention and give clear instructions, and that these are specialized skills which can be taught and learned. So Lemoff focuses on the mechanics of teaching, whether you're teaching fractions or the American Revolution, and he's on a mission to train as many teachers as he can in these basic techniques. His work is particularly popular in charter schools and Teach for America sites. Let me show you some examples of the different kinds of teaching practices that Ball and Lemoff are working on. Here are four of the 19 core practices identified by Deborah Ball and her colleagues that relate to the teaching of mathematics and learning. So we have explaining ideas and processes. For example, explaining what a real number is in a 9th grade algebra class to students who are still struggling with fractions. Or conducting a text-based discussion, like launching and leading a discussion of a major theme in Romeo and Juliet in a 9th grade English class. Or setting up and managing small group work. In other words, working on a specific reading skill with a small group in a 1st grade classroom while the rest of the class is working on appropriate assignments. I show you these examples to illustrate that each of the 19 core teaching practices requires teachers to use knowledge of subject matter, students, and pedagogy in making decisions and taking action. Compare these with some of the instructional practices that Lemoff, some of the techniques that he's promoting. No opt-out means that you can't let any child refuse to answer a question. Right is right. This technique is insisting that kids give you the right answer and not accepting a partially right answer. Miriam Ben-Peretz actually referred to wait time, probably the most durable finding from early research on teaching, that if teachers wait 30 seconds after they ask a question, gives more children a chance to think, and more people might have something to say. And do now, that technique is having something on the board when students come into the classroom so they can get right down to work, and no instructional time is lost. One might say, by comparing these different lists of teaching practices and techniques, that Ball and Lemoff are working on different problems. Ball focuses on tasks of teaching that accomplish content-specific goals and that combine both routine and improvisational aspects of teaching, like framing an appropriate response in light of what students do and say. Lemoff is dealing with general aspects of teaching that can be routinized, like calling on students, passing out materials, getting kids' attention. And these are important differences, which I'll come back to. But what I want to highlight now is what they have in common. They're both giving an affirmative answer to the question raised in the New York Times article: can educators be educated to educate? And they do so because they share the following assumptions. One, that the work of teaching can be specified, meaning broken down into its component elements. Two, that the work of teaching can be taught. And three, that the work of teaching can be learned. Today, Ball and Lemoff are in the vanguard of people who believe that great teachers are not born, but made. That teaching involves stable practices which the vast majority of teachers can learn and use if teacher educators and professional developers provide them with appropriate learning opportunities. Today I want to talk about what teacher educators have done, are doing, and can do to help novices learn the practice of teaching. Mary Kennedy calls this the problem of enactment in teacher education, helping novices learn to put knowledge into practice, to act on their intentions, to integrate understanding, skills, and commitments into a principled and effective practice. I focus on the teaching of practice because I think that the legitimacy of professional teacher education turns on teacher educators' ability and success in preparing teachers for responsible practice. Okay. The traditional answer to the question of how novices learn the practice of teaching is student teaching, a brief period of real-life classroom experience at the end of a pre-service program. Across centuries of debate about how teachers should be prepared, this is the one area that has remained largely unquestioned, at least until recently. New and experienced teachers regularly cite student teaching as the most highly valued part of their preparation, and this assessment reflects the enormous faith we place in learning from experience, even though we know that it is a highly unreliable teacher. I learned just how unreliable student teaching can be as a site for learning to teach in one of the very first studies I did on teacher education and learning to teach back in the 1980s. The study was called Knowledge Use in Learning to Teach, and my doctoral students and I, and one of those doctoral students actually was Deborah Ball, followed 8 teacher candidates who were enrolled in 2 contrasting teacher education programs through 2 years of undergraduate teacher preparation. Each term, we observed core courses in the programs to document what teacher candidates were being taught, and we interviewed them about what they were learning and how they thought it would help them in teaching and learning to teach. And then we followed them into student teaching. I particularly remember Susan, whose program had a clear vision of good teaching, what today would be called teaching for thinking and understanding. Susan was placed in a combined 3rd, 4th grade urban classroom with a teacher who practiced the kind of teaching advocated by the program. And the close alignment between the program's vision of good teaching and her cooperating teacher's practice made this seem like a very fruitful place for her learning. Unfortunately, Susan barely noticed Bob's pedagogy, and neither he nor the university supervisor helped her see what Bob was doing and what she could learn from him. Overall, and I don't have time to go into the details about how that unfolded, but at the end of the 8 weeks, Susan felt that she had had a very successful student teaching experience, which she saw as the final test before independent teaching. She proved to herself that she could plan and teach multiple lessons day after day for 8 weeks, and she learned that she liked being a classroom teacher. What I saw was a huge missed opportunity to learn to analyze and enact the kind of teaching she had been learning for the past 2 years. This case of Susan underscored for me how easily the novice's learning can go astray in the absence of clear purposes, shared expectations, and deliberate modeling and coaching. Doing something wrong? The case left me with many questions about the role of experience and the role of experienced teachers in helping novices learn to teach. And these questions have shaped much of my research and design work in teacher education. In this work, I've been influenced by an essay written by John Dewey called The Relation of Theory and Practice in Education. Written in 1904, shortly before the Flexner Report on Medical Education, which Jonathan Halevi talked about. The essay reflects Dewey's support of university-based professional education, in contrast to the apprenticeship system, which dominated the training of doctors and lawyers at the time and was an essential feature of the normal school curriculum. Like Flexner, Dewey believed that the research university could balance an academic and a professional mission. In the case of teacher education, this turned out to be more difficult than he imagined. Dewey asserts that the professional education of teachers requires a certain amount of practical work, and he outlines two positions on the goals of practical preparation. We can use practice sites to develop the skills needed to do the job of teaching. He calls this the apprenticeship approach. Or we can design practical experiences to develop the intellectual methods required for independent and personal mastery of practical skills. And he calls this the laboratory approach, and that's the one he favors. Dewey acknowledges that teachers face two central problems in learning to teach. One is mastery of subject matter and educational principles and their applications in practice. The other is mastering the techniques of classroom management and instruction. Student teachers cannot attend to both problems at the same time, and when they compete, attention naturally goes to technical mastery. Dewey thought that plunging the student teacher prematurely into the complex responsibilities of classroom control and management would inhibit the achievement of the most important goal of teacher education: developing the ability to interpret and activate student thinking and motivation. Dewey also worried that the apprenticeship model would lead to bad pedagogical habits, because student teachers would base their practice on what works to keep the class in order, rather than what pupils needed to move their thinking forward. To develop the student teacher's mental habits, Dewey outlines a series of laboratory experiences. They include classroom observations of students' mind activity, curriculum study to see what it means for students of different ages to learn particular subjects, and finally, designing and teaching sequences of lessons to groups of pupils, accompanied by critical discussions with more expert people about the work done and the results obtained. I think Dewey was right that a central tension in teacher education is the tension between theory and practice, and his ideas about how to help novices learn theory in practice and for practice are very prescient. Ironically, these ideas are also quite consonant with recent developments in the field of cognitive science. Dewey rejected apprenticeship learning because he believed that it favored imitation and routine action. But actually, recent studies of traditional apprenticeships of midwives, of plumbers, and tailors reveal that people can learn complex forms of understanding, reasoning, and practice that are hard to learn in formal educational settings. In an effective apprenticeship, the master helps the novice learn the practical, judgmental, and situated intellectual work that characterizes the craft or occupation. It does so by embedding the learning in the social context of practice, permitting the apprentice to move from limited participation to full responsibility gradually, and with serious modeling and supervision. So the very goals that Dewey wanted to achieve can be accomplished in a form of education which he dismissed. I've actually found the concept of the cognitive apprenticeship to be quite generative in thinking about and studying the work of mentoring. A very different answer to the question of how the practice of teaching can be taught and learned emerged in the late 60s and 70s in competency-based teacher education. Researchers were beginning to study teaching directly at the time, and some sought to correlate teaching behaviors with student learning in an effort to develop a scientific basis for the art of teaching. Teacher educators eagerly embraced the possibility that such scientific knowledge could provide the content for solid training in valid teaching practices. And here's some pictures of some of the vast literature that was generated at the time. The logic was very appealing. First, break teaching down into a set of discrete competencies empirically validated through their connection to learning. Second, develop a training program where students could learn the appropriate behaviors by means of practice and coaching. Third, evaluate students to determine their mastery of competencies and provide additional training as needed. and finally, certify people based on their mastery of the mandated competencies. Sounds like a logical engineering feat. Proponents of this approach argue that effective teachers exhibit skills that can be precisely identified and transmitted. And the business of initial training is to provide such skills to novices as a foundation for developing mature teaching practice. The signature pedagogy of competency-based teacher education was micro-teaching. Developed at Stanford in the early 1960s, micro-teaching combined new video technology with a technical skills approach to teaching. In a typical micro-teaching situation, a teacher candidate watched a demonstration of a skill to be learned. Then he or she planned and taught a short 5 to 10 minute lesson to a small group of pupils. The lesson was recorded and immediately available for viewing by the candidate, who got feedback and advice from trained supervisors. Then the candidate retaught the lesson to a new group of students in an effort to improve his performance. This was considered a major breakthrough. Micro-teaching offered teacher candidates a chance to acquire skills and develop confidence in a scaled-down teaching context before having to face all the complexities of classroom teaching. And studies showed that novices could actually acquire these competencies, even though it was not so clear that they could transfer them to the classroom and call on them appropriately in the context of teaching. There were, of course, critics, and they argued that this kind of skills training threatened to deprofessionalize teaching by turning out proficient technicians rather than full professionals. But B.O. Smith, who was a leading advocate, countered that such training produces relaxed control, which frees a person from preoccupation with routine acts so that he can scan the situation and respond constructively. Think about trained pilots or surgeons. We don't question the need for that kind of training. So training and resourcefulness or efficiency and innovation were complementary, not antithetical elements of behavior. Of course, the most serious critique of competency-based teacher education was the lack of validated competencies to provide a basis for a meaningful training program. Even the concept of a teaching competence proved troublesome. There was no agreement about whether it should be big or small, generic or subject-specific, propositional or procedural. And think about the contrast between the Ball and Lemoff elements of practice, and I think we're still struggling with some of those same questions. So this is, okay. Now let's fast forward to the present and consider the current wave of reform in teacher education. Pamela Grossman calls it a back-to-the-future development. Ken Zeichner says it's once again a turn toward practice-based teacher education. While there are clear ties to the past, some of the contemporary efforts rest on an expanded view of professional practice and build on advances in our knowledge of teaching, learning, and teacher learning. And all I have time to do is show you some of the compendiums of new knowledge and research that's been generated over the last 2 decades that I think puts us in a better position to think about and to try to articulate what does the practice of teaching entail and what do teachers need to know and care about and be able to do to enact it. Okay. We often define practice by what we do rather than who we are or how we think. A view of practice that focuses on techniques or skills may help account for the uneasy relationship of clinical preparation in higher education. But there's a broader definition of practice informed by sociocultural theories, which incorporates both intellectual and technical activities and encompasses the individual practitioner and the professional community. I think this is a concept of practice that can serve us well. Practice in complex domains like teaching involves the orchestration of understanding, skills, relationships, and identity to accomplish particular tasks with others in specific environments. When people learn a practice, they enter into a historically defined set of activities that have been developed over time by others. As members of a profession, practitioners have a responsibility to their colleagues and to their clients, reinforcing the collective meaning of professional practice. This concept of practice also involves the identity of the practitioners, suggesting that part of professional preparation involves the construction of a professional identity. Sociocultural theory and theories about learning from experience can inform our thinking about teaching practice by drawing our attention to the settings in which novices learn and the role of peers and instructors in guiding learning. As Dewey reminds us, learning from experience is neither easy nor automatic. Professional educators face the complex challenge of using clinical experience to teach principles and techniques, yet the messiness and unpredictability of practice can work against their intentions, which suggests the need for some low-risk settings for novices learning. I think that's what micro-teaching was trying to get at. It just didn't have the right stuff to use as the concept of its training. And some of those settings can exist outside of real-world practice. I want to share a framework for thinking about teaching practice based on a comparative study of professional education of clergy, clinical psychologists, and teachers. This is a study led by Pam Grossman, who looked at courses tied to practice in professional education programs for people in these three fields, and from that data identified three concepts for understanding pedagogies of practice used in teacher education. This is a little bit about her. So these are the three ideas that emerged from this study about ways of teaching practice outside of real-world practice settings in university classrooms. Representations. Representations refer to ways of helping novices learn to see key features of practice. This could be a videotape of a therapy session in a clinical psychology program, or samples of model sermons in a program for clergy, or classroom videotapes used in a course in teacher education. By influencing what facets of practice novices see, representations influence what novices can learn. Grossman gives the example of an instructor who showed a video of herself interacting with a child in a math lesson, eliciting the child's thinking about the problem and then posing additional problems. The students in her course watched the child's responses, asked the instructor about her decisions, and then rewatched the video to clarify students' thinking. Consider how this representation of teaching enables novices to see and analyze pupils' mathematical sense-making, and how the teacher's decisions and actions contribute to advancing pupils' thinking. And it also illustrates that situating teacher education in practice does not always mean in real-world classrooms. It can also mean in records of practice. I'm struck by the comparison between the rich learning opportunities in this small example and the missed learning opportunities in the real world of the classroom that I described with Susan, the student teacher. The second pedagogy of practice in the teaching practices framework is decompositions. That refers to breaking teaching or any complex practice down into its constituent parts for the purposes of teaching and learning. And we've already seen two contemporary examples of decomposition. The 19 high-leverage practices in Teaching Works, the initiative of Ball and her colleagues at Michigan, and the 49 techniques identified by Doug Lemoff, which make, these two examples make very different aspects of teaching visible. And I also mentioned the short-lived and not very successful effort at decomposing teaching in the area of competency-based teacher education. Grossman calls the third pedagogy of practice approximations, and this I think is not so far from micro-teaching in that it refers to scaled-down opportunities for enactment and experimentation that aren't always available in real-life classroom settings. Not all hospitals are teaching hospitals. I'm sorry, I think I lost my place. Yeah. Approximations, I want to go back to approximations. Approximations enable novices to practice challenging components of a practice, of teaching, for example, to make mistakes and try again where the consequences aren't as high as they are in real-life classrooms, to practice new ways of thinking and acting with support, to receive feedback, precisely because they're not the real thing. It's the inauthenticity of approximations that give them their benefit. The narrowing of the task limits the difficulty and helps the novice hone in on dimensions of practice that may get lost in the fray of real-world teaching. And one of the examples that comes out of this research is the example of a literacy methods course in which the students, the teacher education students, take on the roles of both observer and teacher in a series of learning opportunities, which are listed here. They watch a video with 2 second graders who are reading to each other, and they take notes of one of the pairs. Then they are guided by their instructor in a developmental reading assessment of the pair, a particular strategy for assessing young children's reading fluency. And then they are instructed in the markings for this kind of assessment, and they practice using those markings in an audio tape of a 3rd grader. Then they go back to the tape of the original pair and are asked to plan to imagine that they're the teacher about to sit down with these students and to have a conversation about what they comprehended from the reading that they were doing together. So they have to generate questions and group the questions and refine the questions. And again, I think what this example illustrates is multiple opportunities for novices to practice authentic aspects of teaching reading, of assessing fluency, of assessing comprehension, and putting that knowledge together in questions that you could actually ask of young children. So to me, this is an example that serves many of the purposes of the laboratory approach that Dewey was talking about, developing the capacity to see pupils thinking and to act with purpose as a teacher. Contemporary research suggests that learning about teaching develops through participation in a community of learners, where both theory and practice are encountered in the context of their use. It's easy to say, it's not so easy to do. And I don't think it's a dominant practice yet, widespread in our teacher education programs. Across the country, individual teacher educators, at least in the US, are experimenting with ways to make university courses more practice-centered, while also thinking about the nature and purpose of clinical practice. I think of clinical experiences as forming the spine of a strong teacher education program, serving both laboratory and apprenticeship purposes. So if we're going to turn teacher education on its head, providing a stint of student teaching at the end of a pre-service program is no longer adequate. I think we need to think more about the purposeful weaving of opportunities to practice, to learn to analyze practice in purposeful ways throughout a coherent program. And of course, such experiences depend on schools and teacher partners interested in joining and contributing to the important work of teacher education. Not every hospital is a teaching hospital, and not every school is an appropriate site for school-based teacher education. But we need to find those schools where principals and teachers see working together on the combined agendas of teacher education and school improvement as a powerful way to enhance the quality of teaching and learning in schools. We heard about school improvement from Miriam 2 days ago, and I think actually teacher education and school improvement are 2 sides of the same coin, and we can't do good teacher education with school partners, and in some ways I don't think we can do good school improvement without teacher learning. So turning teacher education on its head also means joining these 2 agendas in purposeful and coordinated ways. Every year, millions of new teachers enter classrooms for the first time. Nobody, not the novice teacher, nor her colleagues, nor the parents, nor the students that she's responsible, wants anything less than responsible practice from the novice teacher. We know of the limits of a pre-service preparation in providing teachers with all that they need to know in order to be a competent and responsible professional over the course of their career. But I want to argue that part of our professional accountability as teacher educators is ensuring that our graduates can practice the kind of ambitious and powerful teaching that all children deserve. Thank you.